One of the greatest mistakes of my life was deciding to do a video on every single Democratic candidate in 2020. In my naive ignorance, I assumed that there wouldn't be more than about 15 candidates. Yet here we are, just 2 months out from the first primaries and caucuses, and we have yet more people entering the fray. One of them is Deval Patrick, who has literally no chance of winning, and at first I just planned on doing a very cursory video just to say that he sucks and then move on with my life. But as I began to think more and more about his candidacy, I realized that there is something nefarious afoot. Today I would like to ask the question as to whether he indeed will prove to be the bane of Warren and Sanders' existence, or whether he is simply a waste of time for everyone. Let's find out. What I plan to do here is the opposite of what I normally do. First, I will look at why he was running and what he's trying to achieve, and then I'll circle back and give his biography. He's really not that interesting of a guy, so if you're just interested in him as a candidate, you will only have to watch about half this video. Congratulations to you. So, Deval Patrick was considered to be of presidential timber back going into the 2016 cycle. However, he ruled out running for 2016, probably because he, like many other party bigwigs, was pressured not to run so that Queen Hillary could walk to the nomination. He also ruled out running in 2020, announcing definitively that he would not run in December of 2018. Then, on November 14th, 2019, just 2 weeks after his latest denial, Patrick suddenly announced that he was going into the race. So, what gives? The conventional wisdom is that you need a presence on the ground in Iowa and New Hampshire 15 months before the caucus in Iowa and the primary in New Hampshire. I think that this time frame is a little long. I think if you have high name recognition, you could get away with having a shorter time span, but still you do need to put boots on the ground and you need to get to know these voters. Because these voters are accustomed to having their asses thoroughly kissed by visiting candidates, you have to be there and spend a lot of time with them at corn festivals and whatnot. Being this late in the game, I am extremely skeptical that Deval Patrick will be able to make an impact, and he does not have the national name recognition that I just mentioned. His reason for joining the race is also peculiar and uninspiring. It's one thing and one thing only. The field's a little weak, and he doesn't think anybody in the field can beat Trump. But he can, I guess, because he has an inspiring message of his colleagues are weak. Yeah, cool. One thing that Crystal Ball said about Deval Patrick was something I found interesting. She thinks that the thing that he'll be able to accomplish is that he will sabotage Warren's campaign in New Hampshire, because as a New Englander with some name recognition in the region, Deval Patrick will appeal to rich white wine trail voters. Patrick is an arch elitist, and he appeals to exactly the same kind of voters as would vote for someone like Warren or Buttigieg. Ideologically, he's clearly to the right of Warren, but still some of the same kind of people might gravitate toward his campaign. Is Crystal Ball correct? Well, I actually think that his reasons for joining are a little broader than that, and that in his own mind he would have a much greater impact than that, and that he would also be able to deal damage to Bernie Sanders. When I was trying to think of why the hell Deval Patrick was in this race, I came up with 4 reasons. At first, some of them seemed to contradict the others, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought that all of these reasons could be simultaneously true. And the more I looked into Deval Patrick's background, the more I realized that this is a devious and cunning man. Deval Patrick, unlike many of the centrist Democrats who are running, is genuinely very smart, and unlike some people who have a few good qualities to balance out the bad, Deval Patrick is someone who is completely devoid of anything like integrity. So for him to pull off something nefarious, or to double deal with both the Democratic Party and his fellow candidates, would be second nature rather than some sort of an aberration. Let's look at what some of his possible motives are. I will argue that all of these are true. First, I believe that he is an establishment plant to sabotage Warren and/or Bernie in New Hampshire or South Carolina. I think Crystal Ball is right that he could, in theory, take off some of Warren's voters in New Hampshire, but I think that his real reason for being there is because of the traditional establishment understanding of identity politics. The thought is that because he's black voters in South Carolina will flock to him, thus ensuring that Bernie doesn't win. I actually think there's a possibility this backfires terribly, but we'll get there when we get there. One of the goals of the DNC, I'm convinced, is to broker the convention to flex their muscles and show that the superdelegates, who are the office holders and powers that be within the party, still run the show. They are still quite pissy about being forced to concede some of their power and not be allowed to vote on the first ballot. They want a brokered convention, and one way to get that is to have a shit ton of candidates who all have delegates, and then they can broker the convention and pick the candidate they want. What they're wanting to do is have Patrick go out and grab some delegates, thus depriving them of from Warren and Bernie, and then give those delegates to Biden, Buttigieg, or whoever they end up going with. Patrick is also self-serving to a fault, and I have no doubt that he is now eyeing a cabinet position. I think he's smart enough to realize that as someone from Massachusetts, he really has no value on a ticket, and he clearly is not going to win the nomination unless he somehow manages to win over a lot of people in a cigar-filled room on the 17th ballot. I also think that he is a potential Republican plant who is deliberately inflicting damage on the Democratic Party by calling into question the quality of the Democratic field and the direction of the party. And while I don't think that this is his main goal, I think that this is his backup plan in case the other three things fail to materialize. So let's go through all of these in more depth. Deval Patrick is a fairly conservative Democrat, and I have absolutely no doubt that he very much wants to fight against the rise of progressivism. Just like Nancy Pelosi and his friend Barack Obama, Deval Patrick is vehemently anti-progressive. And in fact, if we look at who urged him to run, a lot of the people who are in Obama's circle, possibly including Obama himself, urged Deval Patrick to enter the race. As one of the smarter centrists, Deval Patrick may be able to land blows against progressive policy positions such as Medicare for All. Pete Buttigieg has done some damage to Medicare for All approval ratings among Republicans more than Democrats, but still. The Democrats know if they can field another effective propagandist, someone who is well-spoken and well-informed, that they can deal damage to policy directions that they do not like. And based on the establishment understanding of identity politics, which is people vote for what they are, the hope is clearly that Deval Patrick will steal black voters away from Bernie, especially in South Carolina and other southern states. This will enable them to go back to their old chestnut about how Bernie is an old white guy who has no ability to appeal to voters of color. That is the tactic they want to run because it's a playbook they're familiar with. As a New England candidate, he also might be able to steal some voters away from Bernie and Warren, although due to the length of the New Hampshire primary, I think that a lot of the voters are a lot more settled in their decision than the DNC seems to realize. Also, it's worth pointing out that black voters are not complete morons, and that they may have other considerations other than the color of a candidate's skin. After all, if black voters work the way the establishment seems to think they do, then all of them would be lined up behind Booker or Harris, and as we see, that is not the case. Black voters still very much support Biden. And because of that, I actually think the person who would be hurt the most by a run by Deval Patrick, if he actually does take off among black voters, which I think is unlikely, but if he does, his number one victim will be Joe Biden, not Bernie Sanders. Deval Patrick is much more centrist, and if the voters who are self-aware as centrist are voting for Biden, well, guess what? Deval Patrick is an alternative. So I think that this is not a smart reason to run, but I have no doubt that this is what the establishment thinks that they're going to achieve. As for the brokered convention idea, the idea here is that Deval Patrick might be able to shave off some delegates from the progressive candidates and thereby prevent either Bernie or Warren from winning an outright majority, whether separately or combined. And that would then force a second round of voting featuring the superdelegates. And I think that would also mean that a lot of the delegates would then become unattached to the candidates they were sent to represent. So that would create chaos, and then we would have some crazy convention politics like they had before the advent of primaries in the 1960s. Once we get past the first round, what would happen is the party's bigwigs would appoint one of their chosen champions, or if someone like Warren or Yang emerged, what the establishment would do is, in order to give that person a nomination, they would then exact heavy concessions and effectively force Warren and Yang to run as if they were Joe Biden. They would not allow Bernie to win at all, even in a brokered convention, because they absolutely hate him, and they would rather lose to Trump than allow Bernie to be nominated if they could prevent it. So they would pull a 2016 screw job and let the country burn rather than allow Bernie to win a brokered convention. I have no doubt about that. The reason why the establishment wants to push for a brokered convention is that they're freaking out because Biden right now is unlikely to win an outright majority, and if he were to win the nomination, or if they wanted to give it to another establishment Democrat, they would need a number of establishment Democrats to pick up delegates to send to the convention to put Biden, Buttigieg, Harris, or name an establishment hack Democrat as the nominee. The first two motives are the establishment utilizing Deval Patrick. The second two motives, however, are Deval Patrick acting in his own self-interest, as he is quite wont to do. Since he's been carrying water for the party by going there to win delegates and not win the nomination outright, and because we know, as I'll show later, that he has always cashed in on his previous government experience, Patrick is no doubt looking for a reward of some kind. In a recent interview, Elizabeth Warren, whose political instincts are terrible, mentioned that if she were to win the presidency, she would definitely include Deval Patrick in her cabinet because she thinks that he's amazing and wonderful and talented. I think that he heard these comments and decided that he needs to advertise himself to the other candidates as well to make sure that they understand exactly how wonderful and talented he is. If he does run, this creates pressure on the other candidates. He can then offer to drop out and endorse them if they agree to offer him something in return. He's very much in the quid pro quo, and this is something that he could do even with one of the more progressive candidates in theory. So while he definitely is part of the establishment, he's also self-seeking, and I have no doubt that he would throw the establishment plan out the window to gain a personal advantage. So Deval Patrick is very much looking to seek concessions from people like Biden or Buttigieg or other establishment Democrats who are far more well-placed. He also knows for a fact now that he can take advantage of Elizabeth Warren, who seems to have warm feelings for him for literally no reason. This might be something of a hot take, but I do earnestly believe that Deval Patrick, in his heart of hearts, has no core. He could end up becoming a Republican plant. I don't think he currently is one. However, I think that he would flip to Republican in a heartbeat if that would advance his personal interest. Now, record-wise, he's always been a loyal Democrat, but we have to understand something by looking at the man's record. The party that he's really loyal to is not the Democratic Party. It's the corporate party, which has two wings, the Democratic and Republican wings. Deval Patrick, as I'll show when we look at his political record, would fit in just fine as a New England Republican. When he governed Massachusetts, he was effectively Mitt Romney 2.0 with literally one or two differences. And we'll go through that when we get there. So my theory here, let's say that he runs the way he's running now. All he does is call it the Democrats for sucking, and then they lose, with or without his help, whether he is deeply involved with the campaign or not. Give him another year, and then he can swallow the red pill publicly and emerge, possibly on Fox News, as a newborn Republican, a born-again Republican, if you will, and then position himself for the end of Trump's second term when the Republican Party will be looking for a new direction and a new leader. Both parties love defectors, and they go out of their way to pleasure and uphold the honor of any defector they can get. What he'll do is use that TV exposure to try to advertise himself to Republican voters. And another thing that the Republican Party, especially the leaders, but also the base to some extent, love to do is to show that they're not racist by finding a person of color who agrees with them, a Herman Cain-esque figure, and then putting them forward as one of the faces of the party. I don't think this would win him the presidency in 2024, but what I do think is that he thinks it would. And now let's look at Deval Patrick's background. He was raised by a single mother on the south side of Chicago, and he grew up relatively poor. However, as an 8th grader, Patrick was able to win a scholarship to the Milton Academy, a highly prestigious school, which often sends people to Ivy League schools after they graduate. He was able to then attend Harvard as an undergrad, and then stay at Harvard for law school and earn his JD. Fresh out of Harvard, Deval Patrick joined the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and then he worked at a Boston legal firm and achieved partner status by the age of 34. So far, he was a promising young man. He had achieved quite a bit. He had overcome his roots, and he clearly had some mind for public service since he had served the NAACP. So it looked like he was a pretty good guy who would become a productive and positive contributor to society. However, this was an early indication which was misleading. I can actually date with precision the precise time period during which Deval Patrick performed useful activities for the United States government, 1994 to 1997. He served under Bill Clinton as the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Division from 1994 to 1997. His primary task was to investigate issues of racial profiling, police misconduct, and the abuse of inmates. These issues are still quite relevant today, especially to African American voters. I have no doubt that Deval Patrick will talk about these issues in South Carolina, which is where I assume he will spend the next 2 months. Now, the question then becomes, will voters accept him as a legitimate authority on those issues? After all, his last involvement in anything remotely civil rights related, at least on a legitimate front, was in 1997. So where has he been for the last 20 plus years? Well, that's a question he'll have to answer, and I imagine that most voters would be smart enough to ask the question. So that's why I don't think he will be getting too much support in South Carolina. From 1995 to 1997, Patrick was somewhat taken away from his primary task by a spate of fires in black churches across the country. This ended up leading to 100 arrests, but no discovery of any kind of larger conspiracy. The thought was that the Klan or some other white supremacist group must have been behind it, but it looks like it was actually just a spate of unrelated incidents of hate. During the Clinton years, there was a lot of racial tension as a lot of right-wingers became more radicalized in their thinking, and there were quite a number of hate crimes. Hate crimes increased during the Clinton years for various reasons. After he served as the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division, he went back to private practice in Boston. However, before his cup of coffee was cold in Boston, he was called back to chair an investigation of racial discrimination at Texaco, where he would head a committee looking into abuses by Texaco of their employees. It was at this exact moment when Deval Patrick ceased to be at all useful to the American public. After leading the investigation into Texaco, Patrick managed to mostly impress Texaco, and therefore he accepted a job with them in 1999, ostensibly to improve, quote, workplace culture. Workplace culture, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a professional class phrase that doesn't actually mean anything at all. Most of his actual work had nothing to do with so-called workplace culture, but rather involved him overseeing a merger with Chevron in 2000. So we can kind of guess where he might stand on the issue of trust busting. At some point, perhaps slightly before or after his work at Chevron, he worked at United Airlines. And at the time he was hired, the company was trying to fight against an ordinance which required that it offer benefits to domestic partnerships, i.e., marriage arrangements between gay people before gay marriage was a thing. Rather than accepting the ordinance or fighting it in court, Patrick advised the UAL to offer benefits to all its employees, and it became the first airline to do so. Now, while this is not a worst-case scenario, and I don't think this will hurt him, gay rights groups at the time actually were not fond of his decision and his actions in this matter. That being said, I don't think it will harm him because there are so many other things we can talk about, like his work for Chevron, his clear use of his government contacts to make money, and, oh, we haven't gotten to the worst parts yet. This is just a warm-up. This is how Deval Patrick went to the dark side. But now we're going to see him slaughter all of the younglings. Now we enter the Saul Goodman phase of Deval's career. In 2001, he was hired by Coca-Cola to be their general counsel. His most controversial action during this time was when he launched an investigation of allegations that some Coca-Cola workers in Colombia had been killed by paramilitary groups while organizing a union. Deval Patrick said that these claims were without foundation and that they were false, but he advised that the company invest in an independent inquiry to clear their names and end the matter. So, translation, the allegation is that Coca-Cola was accused of hiring paramilitary groups in Colombia to beat and murder their workers so that they wouldn't unionize and get higher wages. Deval Patrick said these allegations were false, so he clearly did not believe them, but he did advise that the CEO launch a private investigation, but the CEO said that Deval Patrick's word was good enough, and supposedly because he was outraged by this, Deval Patrick left the company. Most likely it's because he knew it would be a political liability if he stood by after his legal advice was ignored, and if later it turned out that Coca-Cola was in fact guilty of hiring paramilitary groups to kill its own workers. In 2004, he began to work with an even worse organization, ACC Capital Holdings, which was in charge of such pillars of integrity as the mortgage lenders Ameriquest and Argent. To be fair to Deval Patrick, he was involved in the legal side of things, not the business side. However, he was working for two companies, Ameriquest and Argent, which lent over $80 billion in subprime mortgages to unsuspecting homeowners between 2004 and 2006. Deval Patrick is an extraordinarily smart guy, and he absolutely knew what was going on. He was hired to protect these companies from federal investigators using his legal know-how and numerous connections. Federal investigators claim that Ameriquest was in the process of fixing itself at the time when Patrick left, partly following his advice. However, we have to remember that Deval Patrick is extraordinarily well connected, and that this is how he keeps getting all these corporate gigs over and over. He knows a whole lot of people who run in government circles. They are not going to betray him. Patrick left in 2006 before the bottom fell out in order to run for governor of Massachusetts. It's worth noting that of all the companies he ever worked for, Ameriquest is almost certainly the worst. They were one of the absolute scummiest subprime lending companies, and they later played a major role in the subprime mortgage and foreclosure crisis of 2008. Many people who lost their homes that year and in the subsequent couple years ultimately owe a thanks to Ameriquest, and ultimately Deval Patrick as well. Ever the opportunist, Deval Patrick decided to run for governor of Massachusetts in 2006. This was at a time when Romney had done some unpopular stuff, mostly cutting education. His approval rating in a state which always leans Democrat was down to 34%, and he decided not to even run. Nationwide, George W. Bush was deeply unpopular as well. The Iraq War was an absolute shambles, so this was an easy time to run as a Democrat. And Deval Patrick ran in one of the bluest states in the country. Not surprisingly, he won handily. He did reverse a couple of Romney's policies. Romney had refused to join the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which would limit the state's greenhouse gas output. So he reversed that policy and therefore pleased environmentalists. He also increased funding to education, something that Romney had cut, and that was really the reason why Romney had lost a lot of his popularity. So basically, Deval Patrick did the bare minimum to change course from Mitt Romney. If you look at the other things he did, however, he effectively was Mitt Romney, just shorter. He raised the sales tax from 5% to 6.5%. Sales taxes are inherently regressive ways of raising revenue. They disproportionately affect poor people. Deval Patrick, of course, is rich. His friends are all rich. His only true friends are corporations and other corporate lawyers. He was willing to pass part of the tax burden on to the common consumer who's struggling to get by, rather than increasing taxes on people who can actually afford to pay them, say property owners. He also planned to introduce casinos in Massachusetts. This is also a form of regressive taxation in a way. A lot of poor southern states like South Carolina have introduced things like the education lottery in order to justify tax cuts for the wealthy, and then shift the burden onto gullible retirees who are willing to spin the wheel or pull the slot lever, and then use that as a source of education funding or road funding. So this was something that he was trying to implement in Massachusetts, a state which is plenty wealthy and needs nothing of the sort. He also implemented, without any significant change, Mitt Romney's Romney Care in 2006. This, of course, is the same bill that Obama introduced on a national level in 2009. So the difference between Romney and Deval Patrick is something that is very hard to underestimate, or overestimate, excuse me. I mean, they're basically the same with two differences, and then they wear different skin suits. Speaking of parallels between Deval Patrick and Mitt Romney, and how Deval Patrick likes to follow Mitt Romney in various positions, not only was he his successor's governor of Massachusetts, but Deval Patrick is now one of the senior players at Bane Capital, a company that Mitt Romney helped to found. In fact, he's a managing director. So for the first time, not only is he involved with a corporation, but he's not involved as a lawyer, but rather as one of the chief executives. Instead of claiming himself as the corporate lawyer that he is at heart, Deval Patrick now identifies as a businessman. He buys and guts companies. He's a vulture capitalist. How inspiring. Mitt Romney was able to get away with that to some extent, but he still took damage for it. Republicans expect their candidates to be relatively heartless to some extent. However, Democrats absolutely will not like this background for Deval Patrick. Involvement with Bane Capital by itself is, I think, disqualifying. Involvement with AmeriQuest is, I think, disqualifying. He also is involved with another group, which on the surface sounds pretty cool. He's the chairman of the board for Our Generation Speaks, a fellowship program and startup incubator which aims to bring together aspiring Israeli and Palestinian entrepreneurs. So that sounds kind of cool. You form friendships between people who are prominent in the societies of Israel and Palestine. The problem is, even here we can see what a corporate hack Deval Patrick truly is. Our Generation Speaks effectively involves cultivating ruling class solidarity, not solidarity between the people of Palestine and Israel. It promotes business interest, not the interest of people. And it encourages yet another revolving door between government and corporate leadership. If you have business buddies between Israel and Palestine, perhaps they can help each other in and out of office. Deval Patrick's whole understanding of politics is as a revolving door and as quid pro quo. This is how he managed to parlay his law degree and legal experience in the 1990s into both a highly profitable business career and a governorship of Massachusetts. Deval Patrick is someone who should not be trusted at all. This man has zero integrity, and on a strictly human level, because this man is a class traitor to the class of his birth, I think he might actually be the absolute bottom of the barrel when it comes to Democratic candidates. Even John Delaney is a better human being than Deval Patrick. That's all I've got. I don't want to waste another second talking about this piece of shit. I'm Thersites the Historian, and I hope that in time we will all see that Deval Patrick's campaign flames out and we never hear his name again.